the majority of our life is lived in liminal space.
And there's this in-between space, this liminal space.
This liminality that reveals possibility.
I think we're in a liminal moment, but also in a place of transformation.
I have great affection for the church and a troubled relationship with it.
Just to be alive in time means that we're on the threshold of the future.
That can't be the gospel, because God said to love our neighbors.
We don't know what the future looks like. We have to work it out together.
Chad Bahl, welcome back to the Liminal Living Podcast for your second episode with us here. I'm really happy to have you back here today.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for asking me back. I enjoyed our first conversation, so I'm looking forward to this one.
Well, your last podcast is still in my top 10 most downloaded episodes, so
wow,
you get to add that to your resume.
No,
that's the top 10 of Liminal Living.
Yeah, that's meaningful. I appreciate it. And you having over 100 episodes, I mean, that's good for you, and congratulations there. But then to be in the top of that it's pretty cool. So I definitely appreciate that.
You're on some really fun lists, because Tom Ward's on there, which is one of your heroes.
Yeah.
Pete Rollins is on there, and Rob Bell is on there. And,
wow.
So you're sharing the space. I got one on there too. One of my solo episodes. I got one on the top 10.
Okay.
So
fantastic. Well, I feel like I'm in great company, so that's fantastic.
Yeah, it's really cool. Now, you recently got another doctorate, so now you're double doctor, Chad Bahl.
Yeah.
So tell us about that.
Yeah, my career degree, I suppose, from the University of Toledo, is I have my doctorate in pharmacy. So from the standpoint of what I do for a living, I'm a pharmacist. But then, I've kind of always wanted more than that, from the standpoint of just learning, loving theology, wanting an avenue to kind of dive into things as I get some of my own time on days off, and even thinking forward towards retirement. So I wanted to find another path to really, I don't want to say career versus vocation, but I definitely see theology as more of a passion, and pharmacy as more of a way of supporting self and family. So I had an opportunity to study under, you mentioned his name already, Thomas J. Ord, at Northwind Theological Seminary, and I jumped on it. So my thesis, which is what we're going to be talking about today, is something I defended last week successfully. And you had reached out. Thank you so much. You had reached out to me early on, and you said you wanted to be the first person to interview the subject material based off of post defense. So
yes,
I was happy to say yes to that.
All right. Did I make it? Am I the first one? I'm the first podcast?
You are the very first one.
Oh, yes. I am so excited.
And based off the success of this, you might be the only one, but we'll see if it, if people get interested, there may be more. Who knows?
Well, I think the topic it's captured my attention. Tell us the title of your dissertation, because the title was just like, I'm talking to Chad about this.
Yeah. So the title is The Death of Supernaturalism, the Case for Process Naturalism. So I guess
the first part. Oh my gosh, the first part. Death of Supernaturalism.
Yeah.
Yeah. That you're putting some words on some things that a lot of people are feeling. So I just really wanted to explore this. So
cool.
Yeah.
I love it.
I'm excited. That's when I saw the title on your post. I was just like, oh my gosh, that's what I want to explore. I think you've just put words on something that I've had these intuitions about, of some of the big problems that I'm running into.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And hopefully, folks, again, the title was intentionally, for not having more background about the thesis, maybe it would just kind of raise some eyebrows. And I guess that's the point, of just getting people interested to start a conversation. And maybe, again, it'll hit on that same note, I guess, for other people, looking for some answers.
Yeah. Well, what caused you to go down that road, choose that topic, and research it? Why was that the passion that you just really, what's the whole reason behind this project?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I'd say, I've always been someone who pulls a thread until I can find the end of it. So I'm not a half answer person. I don't like to play the mystery card. I like to be satisfied, intellectually. So I've always, and I believe will always be, a lifelong explorer when it comes to seeking, truth. So my faith from a very early age has always played an integral role in my life. And it's always been married for me to the need to find the things that I have faith in to make sense intellectually. So long story short, I found this thing that, again, studying under Thomas J. Ord, open and relational theology, maybe more specifically process theology, to possess the most satisfying answers really to the one, and I would say the one topic that has plagued me more than any other topic in my faith journey, and that is the topic of theodicy. Why does a good God allow the tragedies and evils of this world to occur? And I think when it comes down to it, that topic centers the problem around process theology centers the problem around divine omnipotence. And in doing so, I think it's able to posit some really compelling solutions by framing it that way. And obviously that's something that we're going to get into. But in short, it says that as far as a being who has all the power, well, that's not a perfect God. That God doesn't possess all the power. God gives us freedom. And so if we reframe omnipotence in a way that allows creaturely freedom in which God doesn't have all the power, then maybe, that provides some good answers when it comes to the theodicy issue. But then it brings up the next important question. If we're not framing God as this being that exists up there somewhere, outside of the universe, able to intervene and impose God's will on any circumstance, then what's the best way to frame God, or to frame our outlook of God? And so, and I know it's going on a little bit of a tangent, but I think more than myself, people other than myself are asking this question. When we look at belief in God, and we see people questioning things, it was almost ubiquitous as far as belief in God in the 1960s. 98% of Americans would say they believed in God in the 1960s. Today, according to Gallup polling, that number is 81%. I mean, that's a pretty, you'd say, well, that's still the vast majority of people, but that's a pretty dramatic decline. And we have to ask ourselves, why is belief in God becoming less reasonable to people? And maybe they're having some of the same problems I'm having. And for me, it came down to the framework and the model that we've really ascribed to, that is supernaturalism. But that was what kind of compelled me to pick this topic. Yeah.
Well, I've talked to other process theologians. I'm not a process theologian. I'm very friendly with process theology, but that is something I'm still very new exploring. It makes a lot of sense. I think it has a better framework of supporting a modern view of God than the previous one. And so I've talked with, Andrew Davis and Josh Patterson and Bruce Epperly and yourself, some other process theologians, and I'm starting to learn a little bit about it. And I do kind of jive with it. I don't think I fully understand it, or I wouldn't. I'm still learning about it, but it does seem to make sense. And one of the questions that I've been wrestling with is this whole God structure that we kind of have built Christianity around seems to all be based on medieval frameworks, medieval philosophy, medieval theology, medieval liturgy. And then, we're not allowed to touch it because, it's a thus saith the Lord kind of a thing. And that whole medieval framework just doesn't seem to jive anymore with the modern world. And that's why I really was drawn to your thesis. I thought, I think you just put words on the thing that I've been kind of wrestling with, like, the supernaturalism was just like, okay, so I want to explore that. What do you mean by supernaturalism? I think you started to describe it as like a God outside of the materialistic world kind of a thing but help us understand what it is that we are deconstructing so that we have definition and terms done.
Yeah. Well, first, funny side note, you named some of the process theists that have been on your program. So all of those have been central to me in my journey. Josh Patterson and I have collaborated a lot when we were doing the Deconstructing Hell book. I worked with him. He was a co-author to Deconstructing Hell, and he worked to help me create the Deconstructing Hell podcast. So he's been pretty integral. But the three other people you named, ironically, Bruce Epperly, Andrew Davis, and Thomas J. Orr, those were the three people on my thesis committee last week. So
I saw their faces. It was so cool.
So cool, small world, I suppose, but also pretty cool. So I definitely respect them a lot. So one of the process thinkers, and there's two people, and we'll get into it, I'm sure, that I really frame my work around, or that I really studied when it came to doing this thesis. And it was Friedrich Schleiermacher and David Ray Griffin. And so David Ray Griffin is a process thinker that passed away this past year. So not obviously too long ago. But for me, he was one of the strongest voices, I guess, in my faith journey, for taking the work of Alfred North Whitehead, which is famously incomprehensible unless you just make yourself a student of his, when it comes to process and reality and some of the bases of process thought. But really laid it out in a compelling way, in an understandable framework, and in a way that really made sense today with, again, the modern world and in my way of thinking. But so I use his work a lot. And he defines supernaturalism like this. He says that it is the idea of a divine being who can, and perhaps does, occasionally interrupt the world's most fundamental causal processes. So it's a lot to say, so I'll repeat it. But the idea of a divine being who can occasionally interrupt the world's most fundamental causal processes. So to him, supernaturalism is this God that exists outside of the world that is able to, at any point in time, kind of reach the divine hand into a situation and meddle or change or control or, go against, I guess, that which we would see as natural law.
Yeah. Well, you just described how most people pray.
Yeah.
They're praying to the person outside of the world to step into the world and intervene.
Yeah.
Like, my, great aunt Greta is sick with cancer. Would you step into the world and intervene and heal her of her cancer?
Yeah.
And then when that doesn't happen,
right,
then we have to then look backwards and then retell the narrative of God in a way that makes sense with our theology.
Yeah.
Say, it must have been this. It must have been that.
It's a fantastic way to approach God when things are going the right way.
That was killer. Say that again.
I said supernaturalism. It's a fantastic way to approach God when things are going in the right direction. God did this. So good. God is amazing. God made me feel good. God healed my family member. God saved me in this car accident. God healed my cancer. All this good sort of stuff. But when that doesn't happen, if we at the same time believe that God is the one that intervened to single-handedly do the good things, then we have to also reconcile ourselves to the fact that God was able to do that in the situations that didn't turn out so well and didn't. And so either we live with an unsatisfying view of God or an irreconcilable cognitive dissonance that we just can't pay that much attention to, or else things might start to unwind for us. Some people call that the mystery card. Well, I don't understand it. It's all a mystery. So I get to hang on to the things that I like, and I get to ignore the things I don't like because I don't understand it all. We see dimly through a veil right now. Someday we'll understand it. Well, gosh, that's kind of a pick and choose theology in my mind. So again,
really is.
Personally, that wasn't super satisfying.
Yeah. You described the moment for me when everything fell apart was we were going through, it was 21 years ago, we were going through some really difficult medical wrestlings with our firstborn son.
Oh, wow.
And then in process of that, we were also losing our second son in utero, and did end up losing him.
Oh,
and I was a pastor. And that's when it all just didn't make sense anymore.
Yeah.
And I was so cold. Like, I was just, my whole supernaturalist God was like, couldn't be bothered to step out of wherever that God occupied space into my world and fix things or help me. And that's the moment for me when it all just, and my prayer for like years after that was, God, it appears you're going to do whatever the hell you want to do. I'll just try and stay out of your way, and we'll just keep on our merry way. Like that was the only way for me to make sense of that was, I didn't know what to do with it. And then this whole process and open relational and even the contemplative viewpoints that kind of pulled me back towards making sense of God again, still left a lot of unanswered questions. But then I got into the process and open relational, and like, well, maybe this whole supernaturalism thing is, I wouldn't use those words until I saw your thesis. Supernaturalism is a medieval construct kind of a thing.
Yeah. And, it's interesting because we keep saying, the medieval construct. And I do agree with that. It's funny that the word supernaturalism, it first appeared in the Middle Ages. It appeared about 1,000 years after the life of Christ. This guy named Peter Lombard, who was I believe an Irish theologian, but he wrote this famous book, theological work called The 4 Books on Sentences. And in that, he sought to clarify the things that things that had their origin in God and the things that had their origin in creation. And so he used this term that it was actually Augustine's term, seminal natures and causes. And he would say that some things have seminal causes, ingrained natures, that when I plant a seed, I get a plant, and those things are natural. But then there are some things that are only God reaching God's hand directly in the situation. And those are the things that are outside of the natural or supernatural. And where we start to see that word really first come into widespread use would be in the works of Aquinas. And he was really the first one that in the 13th century began using the word supernatural to describe the actions of God. But before then, we didn't really talk in terms of that dichotomy. So we all like to think that, and I think, we can look at evangelicalism, we can look at really anything that is a belief that we would ascribe to, and we like to think our beliefs are what really truly go back to the origins of the faith, right? Evangelicalism, man, they were preaching the gospel in the book of Acts, and evangelicalism has its roots in first century Christianity. And you really have to dive into what you mean by that. And we maybe assume that the God that is out there somewhere, divinely intervening in an omnipotent fashion, controlling things, has its origin in first century Christianity as well. And it really doesn't. It's really, like you said, a medieval concept.
Well, before Aquinas kind of made this term supernaturalism popular, I guess that was a dichotomy then created natural and supernatural.
Yeah.
What was it before that? What kind of outlooks were there? Take us on a timeline of the evolution, I guess.
Yeah.
Where did this come from?
And not, not to go too in depth, but just to say that's not a dichotomy. When we talked about the activity of God, we spoke directly about the activity of God. Certainly there was the debate of whether or not we have free will, whether or not God controls all things, what that activity meant. But we really never posited the separation between that sort of activity, that it wasn't necessarily a special way in which God worked, that it is either natural or supernatural. And so it's so ubiquitous now in God talk that we assumed it's always been like that, but it honestly hasn't. And so again, what we mean by the terms, I think, are, could be something that we talk about and discuss. But my whole goal, at least in this thesis, was to say, let's kind of rip the veil of that dichotomy, and let's just start talking about God for the activity of God and what that means, and in a framework that makes intellectual sense and that's satisfying. Because I would say that, when we view God as this omnipotent being up there somewhere, intervening in any way God wills, it creates a lot of problems that are hard to solve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, if you look at the cosmology of first century humans, they had like a world system that they believed there wasn't a supernatural element to it. It was just higher up elements of the natural world, and God was at the top.
Yeah.
But it's still part of the natural world. It rains. Therefore, the blessing of God is coming down from the physical clouds. Yeah. And, they really believed that God was up there in the sky and hell was down there in the ground, or Sheol, or the place of the dead, or whatever, was kind of down. And they had like a cosmology that was very like earth-centric and very tiered, but it was all part of the natural way the world worked. And then I suppose science and philosophy start kind of expanding and saying, well, God is actually up there and in there. So then we have to start making sense of things and saying, well, maybe God isn't a part of this natural world inside of it. Maybe God is on the outside. Am I getting close to kind of like a understanding?
Yeah, I would say you're hitting the nail on the head. And I would also say, as far as definition of the terms, one thing that I've been asked while I've been kind of talking about this thesis is am I saying in the word naturalism that I am suggesting God doesn't exist? And that's the farthest thing from the truth. Although you can find some forms of naturalism where are atheistic. Scientific naturalism, by definition, is typically historically atheistic. That's not what I'm saying at all. It's definitely a theistic form of naturalism. But the only separation that I'm making is that God is not someone existing outside of, yet intimately within the world as we know it.
Okay. Intimately within the world as we know it. That is interesting. The whole materialistic reductionism that science, that's the world that science mostly inhabits. And then anything outside of that becomes fringe. They call that then like paranormal or supernatural if it's outside of the material reductionist. So you're not using material reductionist when you talk about naturalism. You're talking about just this is how the natural world works, and this is God's role within the natural realm.
Absolutely. I think I think that frames it perfectly.
All right. I wanted to make sure I'm tracking because I really, really want to understand this topic.
Yeah.
Now, God is not supernatural. Then God is a part of the natural world.
Yeah.
And what does this look like? What does the new thing that you're painting look like? I'm trying to find the words that you used. It was a meta process naturalism.
Yeah.
So definition of terms for the new thing that you're trying to construct for us. What is process naturalism?
That's a great question. So I'll try to lay a little bit of a foundation for you. And one of the things about Whitehead, one of the things about process philosophy and process theology is some of the ideas, although I think from a basic premise standpoint, the ideas aren't super radical, but some of its foundational concepts are. So there's a lot of big words and new terminology that they tend to use. But I'll try to, as easily as possible, kind of give you the, we'll call it the David Ray Griffin framework for process theology and the naturalism that he's suggesting.
Okay.
But so basically, process theology, it's a theological approach that really views reality as in terms of dynamic processes of constant change and becoming, where God is not a detached, omnipotent being, but rather actively involved in the world as a very relational, is a key word, and persuasive would be another key word, force. That process theology doesn't see God as all-controlling, that the natural world doesn't work like that. God works within the natural world, but does so persuasively, guiding, providing what process philosophy calls initial aims for all of creation, for all points in time, for all beings. But we are also free beings, and it is up to us to be able to choose to be in line with God's divine and perfect guidance, or to choose to go against it. So it really deconstructs omnipotence in that way. One of the words that my advisor uses is replacing the word omnipotence with omnipotence. That God isn't all-powerful, that's not really, nor can it be, the definition of a perfect being. Because if you're all-controlling, you can't have one of the kind of great-making qualities of perfection, and we would say that is love. An all-controlling God can't be an all-loving God, because I think within love there's freedom, and freedom to choose, and freedom to not only give love, or not only receive love, but to give love as well. So omnipotence is the idea of this perfectly loving God, and by definition, a perfectly loving God cannot be a controlling God. So that's part of the framework, that I'm suggesting here. And omnipotence is more of a Tom Rundel term than it is a David Ray Griffin term, but I incorporate that as well as other thinkers in my thesis as well. But three key ideas that might be helpful to add to this basic framework of process thought. And he calls this, he ends up calling, Griffin does, his naturalism PPP as a kind of subtitle. And he does so to contrast with the naturalism of science, or most of the scientific community, which he would say was naturalism SAM, which is sensationalist or sensationist, atheistic, and materialistic. So he would substitute those words. And he would say that God is not an atheistic framework, but God is, obviously it's a theistic framework, but he'd paint this as something called Panentheism. And the idea is, unlike traditional theologies, process theology sees God as actively participating in the world's ongoing processes of change and becoming, not as a being coming from outside of creation. So in traditional theism, we have a circle that is God out there somewhere, and maybe that overlaps with the circle that is creation, because God is interacting within creation, but God is outside of and selectively intervening within it. All right, that is maybe traditional theism. In panentheism, and that word simply means all in God, we see as creation as those two circles overlapping. Now, it's not pantheism. It's not the idea of all creation being God, but it's panentheism as all creation being in God. So God is intimately interwoven and inseparable from relating to creation. God does so naturally and necessarily. So that's the idea of panentheism. There's a couple more, but I'll let you follow up if you want to on that.
Yeah, you just kind of painted a picture of a Venn diagram. Yeah. Of the kind of the supernatural theist perspective. there is a little bit of overlap between God and us, the supernatural and natural world. This is where miracles would take place.
Yeah.
This is where, the parting of the sea, the walking on the water, the turning of the, water to wine, your Aunt Betty's cancer was healed, kind of like those are those overlaps.
Yeah.
And then the things on the outside of that would be the tragedies that God let happen, that we then put over to the mystery card and say, well, sometimes these things happen, God's wisdom, and it's a mystery and we don't understand it.
Yeah.
That then is kind of broken down, saying this doesn't work for the modern era. Panentheism then just brings that Venn diagram into like a full circle, right? Like God is in all of creation as a part of the natural creation in some fashion. So am I tracking on this one so far?
You are tracking on it. You hit it, and you said it better than I think I could have. God is intimately, the circles overlap, and God is intimately involved. So we're not positing a God who occasionally works a miracle. We're using in the terms of, and we'll talk about him, but Friedrich Schleiermacher, who was a 19th century theologian. He's known as a father of modern theology, father of modern liberal theology, sometimes called. But he was a key thinker to rework some of these concepts of supernatural thinking. He suggested rejecting the idea of the absolutely supernatural and talking about God in a more natural light. But what he would say is not that miracles don't occur. He would say, to me, all is miracle, right? Because God is intimately involved in every single circumstance and instance of our being, every single problem, every single good time, bad time, always luring, always providing a direct initial aim, always hoping and provoking and wanting the best out of every situation. That is the God we're talking about. And in some ways, I would say that's a more powerful God, not someone who can wave a magic wand, but someone who knows all of creation intimately well and is able to work within creation to lure us towards the divine will and to divine good.
Okay. You used a phrase, I don't know if it was your phrase or if you adopted it from Schleiermacher or Griffin, but you used the phrase soul of the universe to describe God. You want to talk a little bit about what that is, where that comes from, what that looks like?
Yeah. And so it's something that I mention. I don't know if it's something that I necessarily ascribe 100% to, because I can see the positives and the negatives, but Charles Hartshorne, Griffin was a student of his, and Charles Hartshorne used as a descriptor or as kind of an apt analogy to describe process theism, described God as the soul of the universe, which I think, gives you, I guess, some positive affirmations. I think there's some good links there that you could say that God is interwoven and inseparable from the universe. The universe cannot exist independently outside of the soul of the universe, that it creates, sustains, and provides a foundation of being. So that was more of a Charles Hartshorne thing. Griffin mentions it. I don't know if he fully adopts it. I think he even comments on how it has some positive and negative connotations. Like, we wouldn't say that God is the soul of the universe, positing and maybe this is a little too technical, but we wouldn't posit a dualism within God or between God and the universe. So we wouldn't say that, God is of different mystical, supernatural substance. And so the process way of thinking does not posit, it posits dualities, but it doesn't posit dualism. One phrase that is used often is this idea of material mental monism, that we're all and that all things are of the same basic substance, yet with important distinctions. So the material and the mental might be two sides of the same coin. Okay. But if we say soul of the universe, we can almost get back to a supernaturalistic way of thinking. We have the integral, God is intimately involved in our lives. I think that's a good illustration, but I think we can get back to the separation that process theology is trying to get away from as well. So I like the phrase in some ways. I don't like it in others, but that's it comes up in my paper, but that's kind of me.
Well, it sounds like it can create the dichotomy of there's the soul of the universe, and then there's the material part of the universe, and then we're back into supernaturalism again.
Right.
But I also see it jiving, with Trinitarian theology, with the Holy Spirit is everywhere and dwelling all flesh, and like that whole thing. So it is a little bit there. You talked about it kind of being a form of possible monism, which when you get into Trinitarian theology, monism was one of the heresies rejected very early on. But if you really dive down materialistically into what we're made of, like we all do come from the same stuff. Like if you are just materialist, reductionist, stars blew up and now we exist, as Neil deGrasse Tyson says, we're all made of stardust because when everything exploded, then that became the furnace that created all the other elements that we see. So there's like things that are jiving and things that are not. And it's like, is there a theory of everything that we're actually going to figure out? I don't think so.
Yeah. And I think the monism that process theology posits is one that can link God talk with science talk. We can talk about being of the same substance, but we don't have to do so in a way that doesn't allow for divine activity or even the presence of the divine. So that's what's been attractive to me, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, if you get into like Tillich's ground of being, understanding of God, even consciousness studies right now, where there's some theories that the four forces, the strong and weak nuclear and the electromagnetism and gravitational are the four forces that we know that kind of hold the universe together. And now there's like a consciousness theory that says consciousness is the fifth force that underpins everything. And it's like science talk and spiritual talk are starting to blend when you start to think of quantum physics and consciousness. And then this whole supernaturalism, medieval stuff, it's like, it doesn't leave enough room to have these conversations for where we're all headed.
I think that's one
God
of the
is revealing things.
Yeah, that's one of the major goals of process thought is to have something that is a foundation of thinking that can marry the scientific with the theistic. That science doesn't provide compelling answers when it comes to spiritual questions. Traditional theism doesn't provide compelling answers when it comes to scientific investigation. So can we have some sort of framework of thought in which we can have a conversation between the two disciplines? That's something that Schleiermacher was passionate about. That's something that process theology is passionate about. And again, I think that's something that's achievable that medieval thinking, I guess, didn't have in their purview. So.
And Aquinas was revolutionary for his time.
Correct.
And we don't have to say that he figured it all out and now we don't move. Like,
correct.
Now we're free to move the ball forward because there's constant revelations from science and psychology and spirituality that we have to keep expanding and including.
So that's another. I was going to say that's another fun word that I'll throw out there in my 3 Ps. So the first
that was where I was going. You got it.
That's
where I was going.
The first one was the pantheism. The second one is something Griffin calls, and this is his word, admittedly. So it's not necessarily something that had been widely accepted until he said it, but panexperientialism. So every single entity that exists, from the neutrino to the human being to God, is an experiential being. All things have experience, and their experience is far more fundamental than the substance that composes them. So where you might have been getting at, I think, is this word called panpsychism, which would imply potentially that all things have some sort of conscious experience and or mentality. And Griffin's saying, no, I don't think we can ascribe consciousness to all things, but we can certainly ascribe experience to all things. So one of the fundamental underlying thoughts of process theology or process philosophy as a whole is that all things experience, and that this experience is far more fundamental than the substance that we're made up of. And so one illustration would be something that you've alluded to as well, but it would be how science in the materialistic viewpoint of science is kind of broken down when it comes to, looking at the atom. When we were able to, study the atom for what it was, and predict its, activity, sometimes a wave, sometimes
Particle.
A particle. Yeah, exactly. Thank you. We were able to make some good predictions and maybe some calculations, formulations, but there are times when we've discovered that the atom wasn't the most fundamental substance, that there were components of the atom. We had the electron, the neutron, the proton, and even smaller than that. And we studied them. They didn't ascribe to any necessary behavior that we can put into a box or a formula. These things jumped from place to place. These things, acted non-predictably. And so, again, when we start to talk about them in forms of a substance, I think we really limit what actually is going on. When we talk to them from the standpoint of experience, I think we're able to have a more holistic conversation. And so process theology looks at experience and says, well, we are all experiential beings, and we're linked by our experiences.
Yeah. Now, I think some of the indigenous spiritualities from Celtic to Native American, they're going to look at creation and say that it's alive in some fashion.
Yeah.
Whether that means experiencing or conscious or not. The Celtics will say that stone has memory. Like the stones, the buildings, they have memory. They're there forever. They're time tested. They're true. The Native Americans are going to have a very creation-based spirituality where they can actually talk to plants and learn. If you talk to some of the naturalists who are kind of brought up in that tradition, they can talk to plants and learn from them what are the ways that we can heal these things over here, and they have conversations, and it's just I think we're coming kind of a full circle here, coming back to what we've always known, but we rejected under the rationalist, materialistic, reductionist view of the world, and saying we don't have to necessarily, we can re-enchant creation without necessarily making it supernatural, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
I agree.
And coming back to some of these disciplines that have been tried and tested and true, but not necessarily as a rejection of the modern world either. Use this term meta-modern, which is not postmodern, not modern, but the next thing. Would you kind of tell us what you mean when you say the meta-modern world, this post-supernatural thing is for the meta-modern world? What are you talking about there?
Yeah, so, I touch on it. I don't spend a whole lot of time on it, but, we look back at modernity, and we look at the things that made up modernity, like rationality, objectivity, access to universal truth. Those are some of the things that we would say when we look at philosophical epochs, over time, that was what modernity was, access to universal truth. We rejected that with postmodernism. When we embraced more of a relativistic standpoint, when we looked at, diversity of experience and equated that with a lack of certainty and no access to absolutes. We are now in a period that many philosophers are calling meta-modernism. And so we see, especially in deconstructive postmodernism, like Derridian postmodernism, we don't find much hope there. We don't find that extremely satisfying. But we are still of the mindset that absolute universal truth is maybe not as easy to posit as, as maybe we used to think it was. So metamodernism tries to marry and weave together discoverable truth with diversity of experience. So if that makes sense. So discoverable truth with diversity of experience. And so entailed within that are, finding some overlap in some seemingly contradictory things. So the reason why I proposed metamodernism I thought that metamodernism gave us a nice framework for my thesis, was I think we would normally posit rejection of the supernatural with rejection of the existence of God. We wouldn't necessarily say that the God existing and the supernatural not existing would be concepts. We would say that they were contradictory, right? You have to pick one. You can't have both. But I think in meta-modern times, we would weave this. Metamodernism is all about weaving these grand narratives, not necessarily having a statement of universal truth, but a grand narrative that incorporates truths. And we could weave this narrative of a theistic exploration of existence and a rejection of the absolutely, or even in toto, of the supernatural.
That is making sense. That whole, if I look at kind of my teenage self being brought up in modern Christianity, it was very objective truth, subjective experience is the enemy kind of a thing. Don't trust emotion, don't trust experience. That's all the devil trying to trick you. What we do know is this objective truth called the Bible. And then shifting away from that into a more postmodern, which it was more of that subjective experience of God, diversity. What was the words you used? Diversity of experience.
Yeah.
That really nailed it down. But then we have this relativistic space where, a politician can just kind of step into this relativistic space and just say something that then make up an objective truth about it. And then it's like half of the country can then buy it. And then half the country is like, wait, this isn't real.
Yep.
So kind of the postmodern thing did crumble upon itself, except it's weird that the Christians have kind of bought into the postmodern thing when they told me it was the enemy to begin with.
Sure.
And now we have this meta-modern thing, which is kind of a blending of that. I like that there's not this objective bullet point truth we're after, but more of a common shared narrative.
Yeah.
Which I think is the main thing that we're lacking as a people, is a common shared narrative.
Yeah.
Really. What kind of common shared narrative are we talking about here? Is there something that Griffin or Schleiermacher or yourself are saying, here is a narrative or parts of it, or is that kind of up for discussion at this point?
Well, so I'll use that to transition into, because I'm a completist, and I'll be thinking about this interview if I don't get to my third point.
Okay.
Well, I'll transition it to the third P.
We had three of those.
Which is prehension, and so I think that's the grand narrative that we're one of the underlying themes of the grand narrative that we're forming. That when we don't talk about things under the auspice of substance being the most fundamental aspect of reality, we have to replace it. And so if I'm saying that experience is the most fundamental aspect of reality, I'm going to have a term for that. And the process philosophy term for it is actual entity. So one experience, and they call this Whitehead called this a drop of experience. One drop of experience would be an actual entity. A prehension is a feeling of that experience. So if I'm an actual entity, if I am a drop of experience, and I have to, I'm also experiencing those things around me. So the feeling of the experience around me would be a prehension. And when I prehend what is around me, that prehension then kind of forms an efficacious bridge to the next occasion or the next experience, the next actual entity, is developed and created. And so if we look at reality in terms of that, we begin to see how me as an actual entity, in process philosophy would say that God is an actual entity, that I am made up of a conglomerate not just of my substances that make me up, that's not good enough, but of my experiences. That my experiences are more fundamental to who I am than any molecule that I exist of, right? I would say my experience is far more important than my left pinky or whatever the case may be, right? It's far more definitive of who I am than the substances that create me. And
let me see if I want to make sure that I'm caught up with where this is a big thought.
Yeah.
And my brain wants to wrap around this.
Yeah.
And I want to make sure that I'm tracking up to this point or I'll get lost.
Yeah.
So experience, and then there is what we feel about the experience.
Yes.
And we are more fundamentally our experiences than we are just the mere molecules that make us up.
Yes.
So like our emotions about an experience would be the narratives that we wrap around the experience itself. Like, I'm feeling this way about this thing because of the story I'm telling myself about this scenario. Because narratives are the thing that bring about emotions. If I'm following correctly, like that would be like a shared narrative, right? Like,
yeah. So that is in part true, but I think another important underlying theme would be the fact that it is not sensationist. So there's far more to experience than sensational feelings. So let me give you an example, and this is an example that I use in my thesis. So someone walks up to me and I'm studying, I'm sitting at a desk in a library and I'm writing or whatever I'm doing. Someone walks up to me and they put their hand on me. All right, they put their hand on my hand. Now, if sensationalism is all that there was to reality, the only thing I can tell from that would be their hand is warmer than mine, or maybe their hand is sweaty, or whatever the case may be, right? And then what I would gain from that experience would be my hand became a little warmer because it was cold before, and now it's, now some heat is transferred, right? So that's what science can tell me about that interaction. But there's far more to the experience of that interaction. Maybe by the gentle way that person puts their hand on me, I see that they're a compassionate person. Or maybe by the way they grip me, I sense that they are, that they need my attention, that something urgent's going on, okay? There's more to the experience of the hand, being put on mine than just what I feel directly in a sensationalist sense of experience. Mm-hmm. And so the one step further than that would be now, instead of my hand being, warmer for a short period of time, then going back to whatever the room temperature is, I am now forever changed by that experience. That person's emergency or that person's compassion or whatever it was has forever changed me. Their experience has now, in some small sense, become my experience, which has now become who I am. And the one point I want to make with that is that is exactly how process theology posits God's relation with us. So not only is God someone who we experience, but God also experiences us. And what we do affects God and impacts God and changes God. And God is also becoming through God's relationships with us, ever incorporating our experiences into God's, and then formulating the next initial aim or the next inspiration or lore, to the next occasion based off of all of that information. So one of the cool things of process thought is not only does it, reject omnipotence and supernatural, things like that, but it also rejects this, the fact that God, is this unchanging static being that we can't impact, that sits aloof, and just dictates. No, process theology says that, Whitehead said that God is not the exception to the metaphysical principles. God is the perfect exemplification of them. So whereas process philosophy would say that experience makes us up fundamentally, experience makes God up fundamentally. And there's a relationality there that no other form of theism can accurately describe. And for me, it's been a compelling way to think about God.
Yes, that helped me kind of make sense. It took the little the little thing I was thinking that it was and made it a little bit bigger.
Mm-hmm.
That because when we die, the molecules that still made up our body are still here.
Yeah.
But there's something of us that's not here, and that would be the experience that is us. We're not experiencing anymore in this physical body. That's interesting. It seems like our whole theological, liturgical, and spiritual way of being is all wrapped around supernaturalism. From how we share our prayer requests at church to, how we view God when we study. Everything, like our spirituality is wrapped around an old medieval structure. Did you do any exploration of what, like, a new practice of this kind of a view of God could look like in, like, spiritual practice, or even different theologies that we could explore, different ways to, not just ideas, but like how it changes the way we interact with the world using our faith?
Yeah, so I guess there's two things I'd like to say to that. I mean, and I think that's important as well. So if we look at process thinkers throughout time, a lot of them, many of them have been Christian. And that's a major theme throughout process thought, is the Christian thinkers who have affirmed process theology, but not necessarily. There's a large Buddhist strain in process thought. There are, I guess, many different types of process thinkers that would ascribe to a multiplicity of different theologies and practices. But for me, again, the foundation of my faith hasn't changed. The framework certainly has. And as a Christian, I would consider myself a follower of Christ, a believer in the person of Christ, the resurrection of Christ, the redemption that Christ brings. And I would consider myself, to the core and in the fundamentals of who I am, a Christian. Now, can there be an all-controlling, gift-giving, intervening, omnipotently God that maybe evangelicalism tends to posit? I don't think, although there's some process thinkers that have called themselves, and I know a couple that call themselves evangelicals. I think you tend to find process thinkers more in a mainline Christian church. Mm-hmm. But the only thing that I would like to say to that is it doesn't have to change the underpinnings of your spiritual practice. For me, it makes them richer. So when I worship at church, I am worshiping this God who is relational, this God who is interacting with me, this God who is intimately involved in every aspect of my life, redeeming me, and getting rid of the sin that blocks me between, that prevents me from knowing God even more. And Schleiermacher would call that God consciousness, that he would ascribe redemption as a progress towards an ever-increasing God consciousness, and sin as that which prevents our God consciousness. We can do liturgies and practices and meditation and prayer and all these things that increase our God consciousness. I don't think any of that has to change for the process thinker. So that's the one. I think it's made my Christian faith a lot richer. You talked about the afterlife as well. There are many process thinkers that, would say that we don't exist consciously in the afterlife, that we exist in God's, they call it objective immortality, basically God's memory, and that's our eternal existence. Charles Hartshorne was someone that believed that. But many process thinkers, including myself, believe that we continue to, we might not be in our physical bodies, but our experiences are more fundamental, and we will continue in some way to experience after death, and maybe even have a richer, less inhibited God consciousness then. And so I think that's all the process of redemption. And the second thing, as far as application, would be that it gives primacy and importance in a way that other theologies do not to our interconnectedness. That if the framework of theology isn't the edicts of a book written long ago, and I'm not dissing the Bible, I still think it's the most important work, that has ever been written. And, there's a lot of truth to be seen in it. Although I talk about it a lot more in my thesis. But the framework is now our experience of God. And if we can see everybody around us as on equal footing of people that God is also intimately involved with, loves, and wants us to love, gosh, I think that really shifts our framework away from maybe what some of the more fundamentalist traditions within Christianity can't posit. In fundamentalist Christianity, you're in or you're out. You're saved or you're not. You're going to heaven, you're going to hell. And so we see everybody as either on board or needing to be convinced to be on board. We see them as an object and a goal. We don't necessarily see them as just the loved relational being that they are. And I think process theology allows us to do that in a way that more traditional strains can't.
Yeah. I have enjoyed this conversation so much. I've been waiting, because you said I can't do it until I defend it. And so I have been waiting for this conversation for months, and it was worth waiting for. We did a lot of heavy lifting. Yeah. And it was so much fun. I know we could probably talk for hours and hours more, because this is such an important topic, but I think we need to kind of wrap things up here with what you just mentioned. That was a perfect way to kind of wrap it up. What direction would you send people if they're extra nerdy, they want to read your thesis? Is there a way to get it, or just to connect with your work? Where do you want to send folks?
Yeah, I would say for now, reach out to me. As far as social media, I'm most active on Facebook. So just Chad Bahl, Bahl, reach out to me, message me on Facebook. And I would say we've covered a lot of ground. We've used a lot of new words. We've talked about a lot of things that might be unfamiliar to a lot of folks listening to this. So ask for clarification, and if it's not me, it's someone else who might be, an expert in the field. But if this has interested you at all, continue to listen to this great podcast that I've fallen in love with and been privileged now twice to be a part of. And feel free to reach out to me. And that's the best way to get a hold of me. So the thesis, I hope to publish in the next year or so. But, that's probably in the short term. The easiest thing is just, maybe look for me directly if you have questions.
All right. And I know you've written devotional since we last talked, Mornings with Schleiermacher.
Yeah.
So that's a cool devotional. I got me a copy of that. Where do you want to send people to pick up a copy of that? Just good old Amazon?
Yeah, good old Amazon's the best way to do it. So Mornings with Schleiermacher. And I will tell you, one thing, we could have talked for hours and days, on this
was fun. Stuff. It was so much fun.
And one of the people that really gave me a new framework for my thought and helped me to transition to the way I'm thinking now about faith and about God is Friedrich Schleiermacher. And not only did I fall in love with his work, but I fell in love with him as a human being, and his passion, his pastoral devotion to God, his piety, his concern for others, everything he did and thought and believed, he made practice of in his real life. And so because of that, I really fell in love with his works. And I wrote a devotional that each day is just a quote or an excerpt from something he's written, and then some reflections based off of those writings. And so Mornings with Schleiermacher, it's a great and, dare I say, progressive devotional. Progressives don't always get to read devotionals, but this is one I made for progressive thinkers, for deepening of their contemplation and connection with God. So check it out if you're interested, for sure.
Awesome. Well, I'll put some links down in the notes so people can just click on stuff and find you.
Awesome.
Well, Chad, thank you so much for coming on the show. I had so much fun with this conversation.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invite.